Well, this series is really sort of investigating, I suppose the main theme is the influence of geography on art. And so what I'm looking at is the post-impressionists, well, starting with Renoir, I suppose, and the post-impressionists and those who painted right into the early 20th century. We'll be looking very briefly at Chagall, of course, whose work is showcased at Nice. But first, the first one we're looking at today will be the area of Nice, and I'm going to really try and connect the art with the town of Nice, with the invention of the Riviera, and the way in which the structure and the basic ideas behind the art are influenced by place. All right, and the French are very interested in this idea of spirit of place, and that's something that I want to really look at today. Well, I want to start with this view of Mont Saint-Victoire, which of course isn't the view, it's actually the painting. People were a little bit confused yesterday when I said that when I actually opened my window when I was a student, a 21-year-old student, you know, last year, in Aix-en-Provence. I got a scholarship by the French government. I'd never sort of been out of Australia, hadn't even crossed the road by myself. Got there at night, opened up my window in the morning, and this was the view that hit me. It was framed exactly like that. And what really struck me was the way in which the mountains seemed to sort of jut out almost in 3 dimensions. Now, being an Australian, I'm used, of course, to very bright light, but this was something that I wasn't expecting at all, and I was very struck by it. Now, what I was struck by in particular were the basic sort of geometric forms of the landscape and the stark brightness of the light, the cloudlessness, the fact that there doesn't seem to be any moisture in the air, which makes everything have that kind of 3-dimensional aspect. And so when we're looking at Cézanne, and we'll look at him much more in depth next week when we're looking at where he was born in Aix-en-Provence, we have to remember that he really was the bridge between Impressionism and Cubism, right? He sort of takes art into another dimension towards the abstract, away from the Impressionists. And he uses the basic structures of the universe, the cube, the triangle, the cylinder, and you can understand why he could see like this. It's because the landscape in many ways encourages him to do so. I wasn't the only person who was, of course, struck very much by the quality of the light. Other people had been struck before me, and these were in particular the Impressionists and Matisse and Dufy. Here we have Claude Monet. Now, of course, I have chosen an example which makes it look as though he always painted extremely dull landscapes, which wasn't entirely true. However, what is important about these sort of 3 artists that I want to show you is that they all were artists who were born in the north of France. Matisse, of course, born right in the north around Saint-Quentin. Monet, Monet, who of course lives up at Le Havre. Dufy, who's born in the Ile-de-France, anyhow in the north of that. And so are used to dark conditions and also to changing light. And of course this in many ways was the basis of what the Impressionists were trying to do. They were trying to capture the experience of reality, not reality itself, the experience of it, and how this reality changes according to the light. And the light, of course, is a function of time. So they were actually including in their art this 4th dimension of time. And to do this, in many ways, you need this constant fluctuation of different types of light, which you get in the north. As Impressionism moves away from its initial impetus, by the 8th exhibition, everyone was moving in a different direction. And you have Renoir and Monet, in particular, painting in the south, And Monet paints in the Italian Riviera town of Bordighera. And here we have something different. We have a completely new palette, this palette of colour. And I suppose this is going to be the main theme, this idea of colour and light as the theme that I'll be looking at today. All those dark colours have gone and the palette vibrates with light. And the light and the warmth of the place gives you this sense of joyousness in many ways that you don't get with these people are coming out of them, that you don't get in those early canvases. Now, I'll be talking about the Impressionists a little bit later. I just want to give you examples of how the palette changes. Here you have Van Gogh, his potato eaters in the north of France. Is there a seat there? There's another one there, right. Of course, the very dark narrative, the dark palette. What happens when Van Gogh finally gets to the south? He's struck almost by the kind of pagan atmosphere of the Mediterranean. And here it's almost as though there's a kind of sun worship. Here the sun is beating down. These trees are vibrating under the intense heat, and even the shadows here seem to be standing out and vibrating as well. So you get, again, their art is beginning also to be reduced to forms and to shapes which stand out against each other. You no longer really need perspective because you have the different planes and cylinders and shapes doing that for you. Matisse is another person, of course, who goes to the south. This is some of his early work. Remember that he is someone who is very influenced by the Flemish school. He was brought up at Saint-Quentin, and he paints for a number of times. He's told to copy at the Louvre, and this is what he copies, still life, which is very interesting. And you'll see when he actually paints in Nice, in this harmony in red, it's basically the same subject matter. You know, someone, at least the dessert or a table with fruit and so, but it's become simply a blinding flattened colour which serves as the basis of the decorative plane. So these are the sort of, you wouldn't sort of progress, it's a total change in direction of their art when confronted with the Mediterranean. Dufy is another person who works with Matisse. He will be one of the so-called fauves, and this is his canvas when he is painting at Saint-Adresse in the north. This is his painting of the view of the Bay of Angels in the Mediterranean port of Nice. So what I want to do in the first part of this lecture is to talk about the ideas or the theories concerning light. We tend to sort of think of light as something that you switch on or you switch off. It's not something that really preoccupies us particularly. Whereas in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, light had a lot of symbolic ideals connected to it, and it was very much part of this industrial revolution, the development of science, and also symbolized progress itself. And I'm going to then, the second theme that I'll be looking at is going to be this descent towards the south and the idea of sort of hedonism and sensuality, and which is the beginning of leisure and tourism. Now, we have to go back to Paris at the time, or just before the Second Empire, let's say the time of the 1848 revolution. Even earlier than that, in 1832, there had been a massive outbreak of cholera. About 1/3 of the population of Paris in this inner city part, around the Quartier de la Mortellerie, which is right round the Tour Saint-Jacques, around the Hôtel de Ville area, was the poorest of all. 1/3 of the people died. Now, this meant there were great social divisions. The bourgeoisie sort of thought, well, this proved that the working classes were dangerous, that they were infectious, and you must keep away from them. You must make sure that, that they are barricaded away. They are need to be placed elsewhere. And of course it had the effect on the working classes, who thought that they were being poisoned and discriminated against by the bourgeoisie. So this brings huge sort of social unrest. And what had happened, of course, was that people were living in the centre of Paris, we can't see so much in this picture here, but with buildings which virtually touched at the top, where no light came in, where there were open drains, with the problem, of course, with cholera was with water. But there was this sense of a city that has lack of light is a city which is infectious, which is full of disease. And this relates very much to the medical theories of the time of miasmas, the idea that you caught illness through smells, through these dark, dank conditions. And you have to remember also, of course, that the other prevalent disease of the time that carried bourgeoisie and workers off was TB. It wasn't, it didn't just affect the workers. Remember Napoleon II, the one who dies in exile, dies at the age of 21 of TB, and he was a prince. So this idea of light then is connected with progress and hygiene. And of course, when Napoleon III comes to power and reconstructs Paris, Paris becomes the city of light, right? And it's not just because you now have gas lighting along the streets, and it's not just because it's open. The city of light means that it is a new city, all right? It's a city of progress, of hope, going towards the future. So this is what, of course, Napoleon does. He opens it up. You have light, you have the movement of air, and so this was the idea of the essence of modernity. Now, light also had a different significance. You see, there was this interest in light, whether it's for social, political, or medical reasons, but also for artistic reasons. And it's interesting the way in which art always reflects these trends. You can't just look at a painting and think, oh, that's nice. It reflects very much the ideas of the time, and in fact almost signals the ideas of the time. And here, of course, we have our group of people who will become the Impressionist group, the Batignolles. Those of you who've been to Paris remember trudging through the streets of Batignolles. Here we have the leader of the group, even though he won't ever exhibit with them, Edouard Manet, with Bazzi, who of course dies during the Franco-Prussian War, Renoir over here, Monet here, and of course the person who will talk about their work in the papers and will be the great novelist Émile Zola. Now, this particular group is interested in breaking away. Now, I'm just very briefly going to talk about what Impressionism is in relation to this idea of going to the south. What Impressionism does is to break away from the hierarchy of academic art. This hierarchy which gave great importance to, at the top of the level, history painting, mythological paintings, then you get landscapes, then you get portraiture, then you get still life. They break away from that completely by depicting anything, all right? And in particular, images which don't signify anything really in themselves. So in other words, there is no narration in this painting, all right? There's no story being told. It doesn't relate to any idea of art as being uplifting and being morally good for you. And it doesn't really relate to Platonic ideas of beauty, which will also be morally uplifting. The painting relates just to itself, right? There is no external reference to any other set of values apart from the values of art itself. And it's really sort of saying that art is the capturing or the experience of the viewer. And that is what it's about. And that art is produced by an artist using technical measures. And so this is brought about, this is foregrounded very much by the way in which Monet, I'm having trouble here, doesn't seem to work, Monet uses brush strokes, different types of brush strokes, which are very evident. All right, now remember with Renaissance art you have the whole thing sort of air buffed away, so that with this chiaroscuro, so that you have the impression that you're actually looking into a window of reality, another world. Well, here you're not at all. This is quite clear that this is something which is being produced on a canvas. All right, and so it also refers very much to this idea of the reality of the outside world which exists, and what you see is what you get. Right, now this is very much the ideals of the Third Republic. The Third Republic was really extremely militant in its views of having finally brought to fruition the ideals of the First French Revolution. This idea of equality, the idea of a materialism. All right, there is no other world except the world that you see. They were radically anti-clerical. Time and space are something which happens in the present, and time starts now and goes on and progresses. It's not cyclical or a mystical time, you know, with angels and so on. So then, in other words, this art of the Impressionists is exactly in tune with this idea of the present moment being the one that you live in and the one that you capture and the one that you experience. Right? And it is your experience which has to be captured. This, oh, by the way, I haven't told you, this is La Renoir, which is just outside Paris, which was painted also by Renoir. Now, the other interest at the time in this idea of light was a man Chevreul, who was a chemist who was experimenting at the Gobelin tapestry workshop, and people were complaining, as you can imagine the French do, about the fact that the colours were looking smudged. And he did a lot of work on this and found that if you had two vibrant colours next to each other, to some degree they cancelled each other out or smudged where they met. And so after extensive work, he developed what is known as Chevreul's wheel, and he develops 72 segments where he shows that if you have the three primary colours, which are red, blue and yellow, the shadow or the complementary colour of red will be made up of blue and yellow, which is green. So the shadows or the colour next to that one, the natural colour, should be green. So a very, very complex system of gradations of colour. So this was taken up by people who felt that Impressionism by now hadn't gone far enough. Then there were two groups who were going to fill this. This is the Divisionists, and then there is Cézanne himself. Cézanne famously says, you know, I want to make something solid out of Impressionism. And the Divisionists, or the Illuminists, who were Seurat and Signac, felt that Impressionism was too wobbly. It just didn't have any structure. And they were pushing this idea of the breaking up of light and colour. They're pushing it even further, and they want to get an even greater luminosity. In other words, they want your experience to be even more intense. Do you see this idea of this emphasis now on the individual vision of the viewer? And so what they did is to break up the surface of the painting into small dots, small luminous dots, which are juxtaposed and are supposed to come together on your retina. The idea was that colours put together on the canvas aren't as luminous as colours that come together on your retina. This has been disproved, but it was an attempt at looking at how do you describe light, how do you get across this intense sensation of luminosity. So Signac goes, of course, to the south of France, sets himself up at Saint-Tropez and later at Collioure, and Matisse will experiment with him, as will Pissarro as well, and even Picasso. As you can see, Matisse, even in this early stage, is very dedicated to sinuous lines, and finds that he actually can't continue in this vein. Now, this painting was bought by Signac and kept in his private possession for years. It's only really been out in the public domain for, I think it's about 20 or 30 years. And he actually uses the title Luxe, Calme et Volupté, which is luxury. You know, luxe isn't really luxury, it's sort of sensuality, calm and voluptuousness, which comes from a line of Baudelaire's poems. Now, we get now to Cesar. Now, all of these experiments in light and structure, in many ways, come together with Cézanne. Now, Cézanne, of course, was from the south and very influenced by this landscape, which is cut up into these white mountains, deep red soil, deep green vegetation. And he painted all around where he lived. Now, he, as I said, wanted to get back to structure, and he worked intensely with the idea of vision, how we see things. And in particular, he was fascinated by binocular vision, saying that you don't actually see the same with both eyes, which I can assure you is true in my case. But what he attempts to do is to produce this on the picture plane, so that he actually ends up using a series of flat planes, but also very, very intense brushwork, which gives you planes and forms at the same time. So it's the beginning, by trying to produce binocular vision on the canvas, it's the beginning of looking at something from two sides at the same time, which of course will eventually be taken up and become cubism, where you have the picture plane flattened out and looked at from various places at the same time, which of course by that stage has taken the time element out of art completely. It is now simply a visual experience. Just what that was thing. I happen to know the Bibémus quarry intimately. Tony and I went there when we were preparing the tour, because we thought we might take you out there, and you have to get in this little bus, and we got out there. It's about 25 minutes by bus out, and the bus never came back, and there was just me and Tony and the cicadas, and so we had to walk back on a main road with me seething, all the way, and sort of marching into the tourist bureau and having a piece of anyone who was in sight, people hiding under desks, and I'm still getting apologies from the. Now, the other aspect that is important when we're looking at the south is this idea of escape to the south, of flight towards a kind of pleasure zone, which I'm going to talk about, the invention of the Riviera. But I want to look at why the French in particular went down there, and why these artists that we've looked at went there. They first discovered it at the time of the Franco-Prussian War. Our dear friend Renoir, even though, of course, I'm such a pity that Brian's not here, he was drafted into the army, but managed to get himself moved to the south, staying with a lady who cooked him nice food. So, meanwhile, Bazir gets killed and Degas goes blind, but anyway. Here we have then this idea of the Belle Epoque, which is more or less corresponds to the Third Republic. It starts at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, at the Commune of 1871, when you get that week of bloody fighting with 25,000 people killed in the streets. So it's a time of anguish in many ways. The French are going to lose Alsace-Lorraine, and there's going to be this feeling for the rest of the century, right up into the First World War, of revenge, of hatred, of fear of the Germans, this idea that, we've got to get our own back. You also, under the Third Republic, have a number of anarchical plots to try and bring down the government, because the anarchists think that the Republic's too far to the right. You have the huge cataclysmic cleavage in society over the Dreyfus Affair with anti-Semitism, and on a sort of social history plane, of course, you get the development of Freud's ideas of the unconscious. So you're getting this sort of split in society, you're getting a split in the self, and so there's this sense of wanting to go back in many ways to another time when things were simpler, and of course what better than the Mediterranean. But here we have this, I thought, this poster by Cheret, who is the great, with Munch, what's that? Toulouse-Lautrec and the other ones who the great poster drawers. He ends up actually living in Nice. And here we have this sort of this idea of almost dancing on the coffin of Europe, you know, sort of frivolity, sort of sexuality, you know, sex, drugs and rock and roll. It's all sort of happening here with women, you know, in outrageous outfits out there doing outrageous, most un-bourgeois things. And so the same person, this is Cheret, who is in part of the museum in Nice, gives you the same sort of thing happening on the Côte d'Azur, right? It's the same Cheret woman. Here she's frolicking, but you notice that it's actually doesn't look quite so desperate. She's out in a bit of nature and she's throwing up flowers, but there's also this idea of the carnival, which gives you this idea of Italy, all of these ideas of freedom and escape from the difficulties of Paris. Now, this is one of Matisse's later paintings. Now, Matisse, by this stage, had been to Morocco. He'd been living in Nice since 1917, and every year since about 1900, he'd been going down to Collioure or Saint-Tropez, then going back to Paris, and then going down. Finally, in 1917, he finally establishes himself there. And this is very much this image of the Mediterranean, right? The bright colours, the bright patterns that he'd brought back from Morocco, this idea of women as well, of sort of just simply there, existing, not doing or thinking or doing anything, just there for their own voluptuous pleasure and sensuality. This sort of stillness, this sort of eternal idea of women, this eternal, beautiful, sort of sensual landscape. So at this time, Nice, particularly during the Belle Epoque, is going to become sort of the playground of the French who are trying to escape, and, as we'll see, many other nationalities as well. The railroad, of course, of 1860, as we'll see, it's one of the agreements when Nice is given to France. One of the agreements is that a railroad will be built, and it connects Paris to the south, and you get this huge surge in tourism. Now, this, of course, is the Gare de Lyon. Now, the Gare de Lyon is the station which serves to go to the south. So there's this fantastic restaurant, just like sitting in something out of the Orient Express, and every room has a fresco of one of the stations that you're going to go to as you get towards the south. And everyone has a beautiful woman tossing flowers. There's orange trees and there's mimosa, and you sort of visually have this impression of, final liberation, you know, heat, warmth, doing nothing, wonderful sort of perfumes and so on. And of course, being a handbag fanatic, I had to bring this in. Louis Vuitton, of course, develops at this time all of these trunks and special handbags for people to travel with. So travel and leisure are now something which are connected to the south. Now, where is this place, you might say? Well, here we have Paris right up. You can see how far north this is. And you would have to come all this way down to the Pyrénées-Alpes-Côte d'Azur. And so Nice is just over here, right next to Italy. And I want to give you some views of this area, because you aren't really prepared. I mean, particularly me, I'm not someone who's interested in landscapes at all, I have to confess. But this just sort of knocks your socks off. You go there and it's this bright blue and bright green. You know, we used to sort of see it summers being a kind of sort of dirty cup of tea colour. And suddenly it's like something out of a child's drawing. And the bright green and the stillness and the light reflecting on it is absolutely enchanting. So you can imagine this is from Villefranche, which we'll actually be looking at a museum up here. This is the Bay of Angels, and you can see this sweep going around. It's called the Bay of Angels because St. Réparade, after her martyrdom, was pulled in a boat by angels who then sort of rather unceremoniously dumped her on the shore, and that's where she landed. So this is the name. It's also an area which has what I would consider the best of both worlds. It has the kind of colour and spontaneity, a bit of a euphemism there, of Italy, and yet the order and structure of France. So it's like living in Italy where you've got something that works. And, you know, which is absolutely the best sort of place that you could possibly have. And so you get these wonderful coloured facades, you know, and the Baroque facades here. Look, even the domes are made with these tiles, ceramic tiles. Colourful buildings, you know, steep walkways. Or you'd almost think you're in Naples at some stage without the squalor, and beautiful sort of, you know, every window has tree, you know, has geraniums and flowers and crawling all over it. It's absolutely enchanting, and if it can enchant me, I mean, that's quite something. Now, Nice started out, I want to actually talk a little bit about the history of Nice, because it's really important in many ways to the way in which the painters saw it at the end, well, in the 20th century. Now, Nice sort of started out as a kind of schizophrenic way, because you actually have the hills behind Nice, and you have the littoral, you have the coast. So a town was started about 2,000 years ago by the Greeks after a victory, and the goddess of victory, of course, is Nicaea, and so this is where you get the word Nice coming from. And this little town sort of was invaded, you know, it has for 2,000 years until it was invaded by the British and the French tourists. But the real town that was important was the town up in the hills at Chenelem, which was started by Augustus Caesar. Now, remember, at the time, the Via Julia Augusta went from Rome down up to Paris, and this was sort of, this particular area above what is, you know, in the hills of Nice, was the last post of what the Romans thought as civilization before they went into the barbarian land of the Gauls. And so they had an amphitheatre, as every town had. It had a structure, you know, it had an amphitheatre, it had a theatre, and there's clearly evidence that 10,000 people lived there. And you can see this up, these arenas are still there. It doesn't seem to work over there, does it? Just as the Matisse Museum up here. Now, this area was devastated, of course, at the time of the barbarian invasions, but the barbarians didn't worry so much about the little town of Nice. These are some of the ruins which still exist. So if you want to look at it from that point of view, it's very interesting. But it means that Nice has this, in fact, most of the Côte d'Azur have Roman ruins, and so when Picasso and Renoir start painting there, they reference this idea of going back to a kind of Arcadian past, to the real past of Greece and Rome, you know, the roots of Western civilization, and the idea of nymphs and shepherds, and, well, very much in both of the art of both of those people. So this is this idea that I just wanted to show you this is from the top of the hill looking down onto the town of Nice. So you get a very, very different view. And I wanted to actually show you that Nice, of course, at this time, when the time of the tourists, of course, actually wasn't part of France. It belonged to the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, which was Savoy and this part here. And this, of course, Italy didn't exist at this time either. Italy, of course, isn't unified until the 1860s. So Nice, of course, has its own language. It has its own culture. Now, for a while, it came under the hegemony of the Dukes of Anjou, because, of course, France didn't exist either in the form, the hexagon that we know it now. It was a series of dukedoms, you know, with the princes of Provence. So the Dukes of Provence and the Dukes of Anjou fought over Nice. Finally, Nice decides that it is better to be under the Dukes of Savoy, and so that's where it will stay. And indeed, it was a very shrewd move, because the French, or what you would call the people from Anjou and the king, who was in the Ile-de-France, invaded and tried to take Nice, because it was quite an important port. And in fact, you even get the Saracens and the French joining forces to destroy Nice. At that time, however, when they were tried to destroy it in the 17th century, the Dukes of Savoy had actually placed the Shroud of Turin, which is now in Turin, in the citadel above the city of Nice. And the Duke of Savoy, when he was being told that he had to give the citadel over to the Saracens and the French, and he sort of sent out a message saying, I can't, God has told me to put the shroud there. Well, it worked like a charm with the French, and of course once the French wouldn't back up the Saracens, that was the end of the invasion. So the Shroud of Turin, whatever you think of it, was a very useful tool and has become very much identified with the House of Savoy. Or they needed a kind of a symbol. I mean, every other house had something, and they had the shroud, which they eventually then take to Turin, which is the capital of their kingdom. Now, this is old Nice at the time of the 17th century. It's exactly the way it is now, exactly the same shape. You have the citadel up here, which was destroyed by Louis XIV. He sort of bombed it completely to the ground. And so what you have here is a series of crenellations and this very old, winding, colourful little street. It had its own Renaissance. It had a series of painters from the Brera family who painted enchanting altarpieces. You could actually do a whole tour going through Liguria and Lombardy down into the Riviera, where these brothers and this family actually produced these extremely graceful paintings, not unlike Sienese art, with the Madonna here protecting the Brotherhoods, which we'll look at in a moment. Now, Nice then was sort of fine for 2,000 years. It was terribly poor. But what happened in 1766? Well, the Scot, Tobias Smollett, who was a physician and also a writer, a friend of Goldsmith, Samuel Johnson and Oliver Goldsmith, wasn't feeling very well and had been told by his doctor that possibly going to a different climate might help. So this is this idea of, there was no antibiotics for tuberculosis, go to a better climate. And he arrives and spends 2 years in Nice. Now, Tobias Smollett was part of the Grand Tour. Remember that people would go through France up to Italy. And of course, at this time, Nice really is considered as more or less Italian, which was one of the reasons why he went to stay there rather than somewhere in the French, because the English hated the French and probably still do. All right, now, Smollett, of course, was the original sourpuss. He's never had anything nice to say about anyone. And his writings exude bile and nastiness and appeal to every base English prejudice. He actually sort of said, this is what he talked about the French, he said, oh, they're women. He said, they look like something out of Indian tribes of America and the Hottentots of Africa. When I see one of these fine creatures sailing along in her tawdry robes of silk and gauze, frilled and flounced and furlaballed, with her fake locks, her fake jewels, her paint, her patches and her perfumes, I can't help looking upon her as the vilest piece of sophistication that art ever produced. Well, that's for starters. Then he goes on to talk about how the people at Nice, they're such dirty knaves that no foreigners will trust them on the way of trade. They've been known to fill their oil casks half full of water and their anchovy barrels with stinking heads of fish in order to cheat their correspondents, and so on. However, the same Smollett is moved to lyricism when he talks about the climate. And he sort of says, there is less rain and wind in Nice than in any other part of the world that I know. And such is the serenity of the air that you see nothing above your head for several months together, except a charming expanse of blue sky without cloud or speck. I can scarce help thinking myself, when I stand on the rampart, I can scarce help thinking myself enchanted. I mean, this is amazing. The small extent of country which I see is all cultivated like a garden. Indeed, the plain presents nothing but gardens full of green trees, loaded with oranges, lemons, citrons and bergamots, which make a delightful experience. So in other words, nature itself was very important. In fact, they've found that it actually rained 1/3 of the number of days as it did in in London, which probably is no surprise to anyone. And during his 2 years that he stayed there, Smollett produces a book with which is a series of letters, and adds to it all sorts of things, such as a rain chart for every day, a temperature chart for every day, even though he adds to it, I'm waiting for decent technology coming from Germany. These people really don't know too much about temperature and so on. He adds all sorts of things that a guidebook would need. So when he goes back and publishes his travels through Italy, France and Italy, it's an instant success. It's sold out. There are even pirate versions made by the Irish, of all people, and it's translated into Swedish and Danish, and it appears in periodicals. So he really marks the end of the people of Nice starving to death and the beginning of them becoming tour guides. And this, of course, the problem with getting to Nice was, of course, it took 3 months or 4 months to get there. This is Gilray's version of getting there. Of course, you can see that he's an English cartoonist. Even the pigs and the dogs look treacherous and ghastly. But of course, you had to get across from England on the Channel across to Paris, and of course sometimes the boat didn't go. You had to wait, and you waited in the port. Then you had to get to Paris, then you had to get all the way down to Marseille, and then from Marseille you got a horse-drawn something up to Fréjus, and from Fréjus finally you got to Nice. And of course, if you were ill in the first place, it wasn't terrific. But what happens is, of course, that it means that from now on, this part of the world, which is up until 1860 belongs to Italy, is going to become what is known as the Riviera. And it wasn't just old Smollett, who ends up in Lawrence Stern's book as what's his name? Snodgrass. He's such a nasty character. Another Lord Brougham, all right, who was Lord Chancellor, and who holds the record for the longest speech in Parliament. He's even worse than me. It was 6 hours. And he also was someone who worked against slavery. He was a very innovative person and not used to having people tell him what to do. But he was utterly exhausted after all of these work in public office, and came over to have a look at Nice. However, there was a cholera outbreak, and the Sardinians had sealed the border and he couldn't get across, and a bit annoyed by this, he was pushed back to an area near Cannes, took an inn for the night, discovered bouillabaisse, and literally never went back to England. And so this is the beginning of Cannes, which will become another one of the great places for people to come. And the third person who popularises for the English, and they're the main people who are going to create the Côte d'Azur. They're the people who actually name it the Côte d'Azur from a poem used in French. Another one is a doctor, Dr. Henry Bennett, who himself was suffering from a lung disease. It could have been asthma, it could have been anything, there wasn't a distinction. And he went to Menton and wrote a book talking about winter in the south of Europe, which was a bestseller and has hardly been out of print since. And people flock to Menton. Each of these towns boasts its climate as being better than the other. And this was the one which the hills of Menton were covered in sanatoria. And right through up to the 20th century, you get even people like Catherine Mansfield, Robert Louis Stevenson, all of these people who have any problems, they go and they virtually die at Menton. And so some people say, look, it's a terribly mournful place in many ways. So this then is the beginning of the Riviera. And these people, of course, come in winter. That's the point, isn't it? They're called hivernants, wintering people, and the season ends in April when they all go back to see, to be in England now that April's there. So, of course, everything closes in Nice and on the Côte d'Azur. And the summer season, for which, of course, it's famous now, only starts after the First World War, when American troops will be taken there on leave and will discover it and then come back, and a writer persuades someone who has a hotel there because his guests are coming, could they open the hotel for exceptionally in summer, and he does, and that is the beginning of the influx of the Americans. So it's really the Americans who bring summer to the south of France. Anyway, back in 1830, the English had flocked there. In fact, the generic word for a tourist was an Anglais. And they said, yes, il y a beaucoup d'Anglais. There are a lot of tourists, i.e. Anglais here. I don't know whether they're German or Swedish. Do you see what I mean? It was just, they were the people who came. And the English, being the English, and I hope I'm not insulting too many people, were rather arrogant in their attitude to the locals. They considered them as something which were there just to serve. And but most of these people that came were Protestants, and so Protestant churches set up, and there was a great sort of famine in 1830, and one of the preachers from one of the little Protestant churches passed round the hat and gave money for the unemployed to build what was so desperately needed at Nice, was a promenade for the English, right? So that they could not actually have to rub shoulders with the locals, who actually by now had just gone away because they hated Nice in winter because of all the English coming in. And but they wanted to be able to go out with their daughters and not have these ruffians hanging around, which is fair enough. And so this is during this time that the Promenade des Anglais, the English walk, is constructed. Now, of course, the Americans weren't all that pleased, and so there you get, when they come later on, if you look at a map of Nice, the extension is the Quai des Anglais, Quai des États-Unis. So you've got all of that, Anglo-Saxons have taken over all that area. Well, we need to talk a little bit about the unification of Italy and how France ends up with Nice. Now, the Kingdom of Sardinia and the Piedmont had as its Prime Minister Cavour. Cavour, who, by the way, was a French speaker and was a great Francophile, and wanted to unite the northern part of Italy. He wanted to get the Austrians, who actually had Venice and all of this area here, out. In fact, the Austrians had all this area as well. And his idea was to unite this part of Italy. It never occurred to him in his wildest dreams that you'd have the south and Sicily. It's really quite interesting. And so he enters into, to cut a very long story short, he enters into a pact with Napoleon III, saying that, look, his troops would engage in skirmishes with the Austrian army, get the Austrians engaged, and then have to call on their allies across the border, the French, to actually come and intervene and actually squash the Austrians. But so it didn't look as though the French were being the aggressors. And indeed this was done, and so all of this, the French at Solferino managed to get rid of the Austrians, and in recompense for their aid, the Piedmont said that they would cede to France Savoy and all of this area around here, which is Nice. So it then becomes French. Now, someone who was a Niçois, who was born in Nice, was very unhappy about this. This was Garibaldi, who was the great campaigner. You know, he'd fought for liberties. You know, he probably just liked adventure. You know, but he fought in the United States, he'd fought in Uruguay, and he was instrumental also in getting rid of the Austrians. Now, he was not happy that his homeland had been given over to the French, and you know, wanted to get it back. Cavour had an ambiguous relationship with him. He called him that savage, and Garibaldi called him that low intriguer. So, I mean, so much for the sort of idea. The long and the short of it was that Garibaldi is not given any troops to liberate Nice, and decides that he's going to unify all the rest of Italy, takes his own volunteers down to Calatafimi, takes over Sicily, comes up through the toe of Italy, and is finally met by the King of Sardinia, Sardegna, Umberto, gives up his arms. And at this stage, reluctantly, Cavour agrees to the whole unification of Italy. Anyway, that's how come there is then a plebiscite, to the Niçois. Do you really want to be French or Italian? And surprisingly, considering the amount of French garrisons that were there, they all voted that they wanted to be French. So this is a statue of Garibaldi there, and he's buried up in the cemetery up on the hill. So by now you have Nice then as being is now part of France. It's connected, as I said before, one of the things that Napoleon III said that he would do if he was given Nice was that he would connect it to the railroad. And so the railroad comes, and with it this plethora of tourists from everywhere. So Nice is now markets herself as being this the carnival, this idea, again, as we spoke of before, of voluptuousness, sensuality, amusement, leisure, but also this idea of being sort of the essential, the real France, the real peasants, the touch of going back to authenticity, as opposed to the sophistication of London and all of these other places. You get girls in peasant gear, so you're foregrounding nature and the local customs. So you get this kind of mixture of sophistication and authenticity. Now, the English and the others really loved Nice because it is essentially an Italian city. I mean, up until 1860 it was. And so you have all of these Baroque churches. This is the Gesu Church, which had been built at the end of the Baroque era for the Counter-Reformation. I'm glad to see we've got Kathleen here, the Counter-Reformation guru. And this is an enchanting little chapel with, as you have with the Counter-Reformation, this idea of didactism of the interior of a church, leading you from the simple life, all ground on the floor, and the sides are very simple chapels, and then finally as you get towards the ceiling, you're taken up by about 170 angels which take you up into heaven. It's absolutely the most enchanting little chapel, amazing. Now, the other thing that's quite interesting about Nice is that it has continued this Catholic tradition, or Mediterranean Catholic tradition, of the Brotherhoods, the penitent orders that you find in Italy and in Spain, of course. That's what you would remember. And of course, this outfit is chosen by the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the penitent orders were started, I think, I think they started out of the Dominicans, or was it the Franciscans? The Dominicans, was it? I thought it was the Francis. Anyway, they were lay orders, the people who weren't actually in the church, but lay orders who looked after, or very closely worked with the clergy to look after the welfare of the community. This is at a time when you didn't have Centrelink, and these people actually, looked after the health of people, the burial, looked out. They were sort of formed hospitals. They had their own ambulances and so on. And in Nice, you actually have 4 of these little penitent orders and penitent churches near the centre. And the black penitents were the ones that officiated at the ceremony, death ceremonies, and also they accompanied the condemned towards, their torture or their execution. And they chose black not just because of death, but for humility. This idea of it being a non-colour, just the way another order, or the white penitents, actually worked with the sick, and they also were dressed in white, which isn't very good, I suppose, if you're working with the sick, but was the idea it was, again, a non-colour, it was humility. And in fact, this was why they were actually masked in many ways, because it was this anonymousness, that wasn't me who was giving this charity, you were doing it anonymously for the church and for Christianity. It actually didn't have the sinister overtones that we probably see in it. Now, you can't actually get into this little chapel, which is there, but it was open one day for some reason. And of course, me with the old foot in the door technique, got in there and saw someone talking at the back, and there was a lady talking about this wonderful Brea altarpiece, and there's a wardrobe of penitent outfits hanging there. And I said, oh, very interesting. And she said, oh, take a seat, sit down, I'll tell you about it. So this went on, and in the end, I think I've persuaded her to actually let us in, and she's going to talk about everything in this little chapel in French, and I'll translate. So that's going to be interesting. Now, there's another group also in Nice who are really quite, they're not militant, but they have open days, and these are the red penitents who are devoted to the Shroud of Turin, the Saint-Suaire. And they, as I said, they're all there in their red vestments and will talk to you as you go in 3 or 4 times a week. And I'm now on their mailing list, so I know the absolute latest on the Shroud of Turin. I've been taken into their bosom. So we might also be able to have a look in that chapel as well. And what you have here is a newspaper article with Queen Victoria. This is coming through and meeting the procession of the militants. Now, this, of course, was a kind of a clash between Protestantism and Catholicism. You know, this old style Catholicism that the English sort of tutted about. In fact, the Grand Tourist tutted about. Now, by the time we sort of get this invasion of the British then bring with them their eccentricity, and they also don't want to live, of course, you know, horror of horrors, in the too close to the locals. So we've got the Promenade des Anglais, and they build up on that where the Roman town had been, which from Chenelum becomes Chimiers, right? So you get this dichotomy which had existed before between the old Greek city down on the coast and the Roman city up in the hills. You get the terracotta and the beautiful yellows of the facades on the coast, and you go up and you get all these white Belle Epoque buildings up on the hills. It really actually forms quite a charming contrast. But there's another exclusive area which was taken over. This is a fellow who was a colonel in the British Army in India, and he came back and built himself a pink castle, as you do, on the hills of Nice. So you get all these extraordinary sort of follies, you know, these illusionary architecture, Moorish mosques, you know, faux Gothic, faux everything. This actually was bombed during the war, and this is from an old postcard, as you can see. All right, now we have the British coming here. Here we have sort of, you know, the Prince of Wales at the Nice Carnival with the Battle of Flowers. And of course, who should come but the Queen herself? Queen Victoria arrives, complete with an entire sort of railway train, all her servants. And of course, the Nice are absolutely delighted. Up until then, they'd, you know, earned a couple of francs a day. When the British come, it goes to 30 francs a day. And she can't just stay anywhere, of course, in the local, you know, dives. And so the Hotel Regina for the Queen is built up on Chimiers. And here we have a newspaper picture of Queen Victoria having a whale of a time here, probably somewhere up on the, you know, in front of her hotel, with her Indian servants. And some of the Russians who, well, I'll talk about the Russians in a moment, were sort of saying, you know, oh, she doesn't realise that she's got such second-rate servants. So there she is, not realising that her servants are considered second-rate by the rest of the aristocracy of Europe. She evidently went there for 5 years and used to sort of, you know, skittishly gamble around the place. Perished the thought at the idea of, you know, being in Nice, and is very, very loath to leave it. You know, she loves the heat. And this is actually one of the advertisements of the time, with showcasing this hotel. When she came, she took over half of it. Unfortunately, after the war, after the First World War in particular, no one came back to Nice, and all these magnificent hotels have been turned into apartments. So it's very, very hard to get in to see what they were like. But you can see what extravaganza. Everything is now on a gigantic scale. Now, it wasn't just the British who came, of course, the Russians, and of course they've come back now. I mean, the Côte d'Azur is full of Russians. The Dowager Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, my Russian isn't very good, came there because she was invited by the Kingdom of Sardinia, because Russia had lost its port during the Crimean War, and the Sardinians decided it would be a good thing to have them as allies. And so she's invited to stay, and she brings with her all of the Russian aristocracy, who set themselves up next to the British. So you've got the Niçois down there, you've got the British up at Chimieres, and then over here at the Pays you've actually got the Russians. And so immense fortunes are built. And of course, as the English had their own little churches, their Protestant Lutheran churches and so on, so the Russians put up their Orthodox church as well. So it looks like Disneyland. You go along and suddenly soaring up this immense thing, beautiful icons, gilded and so on. And the Czarek died there unexpectedly as well, and there's a huge chapel, a tomb for him. It wasn't just the aristocracy, but also, I don't know if you remember me speaking about Marie Bashkirtsev when we were talking about women artists. She came from an aristocratic Russian family and had trained in Paris as an artist, but had come up against the French, salon system, wasn't allowed to get into the Beaux-Arts, women couldn't sketch in the nude, and so was revolutionary in allowing herself to be admitted to the Atelier Julien, and where she actually did some work. She contracted tuberculosis and so was sent to Nice with her family, where she will eventually die at the age of 26, but not before having sort of revolutionised the whole sort of Russian society by publishing her diaries of tell-all things that went on, and sort of generally being an absolute firebrand. Now you can still buy, if you're interested, you can buy her memoirs. I got it when I was just in Paris, and someone who was writing a book about it, I read, he said, you can't help but fall in love with this young girl. Where she lived was what is now the Fine Arts Museum. Now, it wasn't then just the Russians who had invaded, but the French themselves. The Empress Eugénie came, and of course that meant that all of the society of the Second Empire and the Belle Epoque are going to rush in. Now, we've spoken about the great banking families of the Second Empire, the Rothschilds. And they, particularly James and Alphonse Rothschilds, were the two branches of them that were in France, and they sort of married between themselves. And this girl, Beatrice Rothschild, married her cousin, which meant that she ended up with immense personal wealth. Can you imagine being a sort of daughter-in-law and daughter of a Rothschild? And then also proceeded to marry another scion of a banking family, the Baron of Abruzzi, who actually appears in, the luncheon of the boating party. There's a man with a top hat at the back, and that's Baron of Abruzzi. He actually was very prominent in the world of fine arts in Paris at the time. So this looks as though butter would melt in her mouth. In fact, she was an absolutely really tough, dynamic woman. And she saw these extraordinary villas which were being built on the Côte d'Azur, and in particular on the Cap Saint-Jean-Ferrat, which is just round from Villefranche. So you've got Nice, and then you've got the Bay of Villefranche, which is 10 minutes away, and then this tongue of land that goes out. And King Ludovic of Belgium, that horrible person, who used to actually put his beard in a piece of, that's got nothing to do with it anyway, and bought a large piece of land, and Beatrice had decided that she wanted some as well. So she built this particular villa, and as you stand, you look down on either side to this turquoise blue sea with these little boats, absolutely like paradise. And she built a villa which is a kind of pastiche of a kind of Renaissance villa, and these gardens. Now I'll give you a view of it. I mean, nothing can actually give you. How many people have been to the Abruzzi? Yes, it's wonderful, isn't it? There are 7 different gardens. All right, it's quite contrived. Each one has a different theme. There's a rose garden, there's a French garden, and this actually then has waterfalls that come with music. But the background against the hills and then over the sea and then flowers everywhere is absolutely exquisite. And she also has the most extraordinary collection of porcelain chamber pots and something. You know, she's real eccentric. It's a sort of collection that is really interesting to go and see. Now, as the Belle Epoque moves on, of course, it's not just the aristocrats that come. By now you have Monaco, which has built its casino. The casino was built by the same person who built the Paris Opera, Garnier, and you get the great casino at Nice. After all, you have to have something to do when you're relaxing in paradise. And of course, with gambling and with these high flyers come, of course, the great courtesans of the Belle Epoque. All right, you've got Liane de Pougy, and particularly La Belle Otero, who comes down here as well. And to house these people, all of these majestic hotels are built. I mean, originally, when Smollett was arriving in the 18th century, people just housed or got a room with a local family. But gradually, of course, I think by 1900, there were 150,000 English who came in one season. There aren't any statistics for the Russians, but you can imagine this invasion. I think something like 6 out of every 10 people in Nice were tourists, which is quite possibly what it is now. But so here we have the Negresco. The Negresco was built as extraordinary Belle Epoque architecture, this sort of, illusionary, it's almost Luna Park type architecture, built by a Romanian, which is why it has the name of Negresco. It's got nothing to do with him being a Negro or anything like that. So here you have this sense of the coast. It's no longer just sort of hedonism and getting away from the angst of Paris, but it's also is about glamour and being on the cutting edge of technology. Here you have motor cars, the first Dions, and the Bugattis. Here they are pulled up outside the hotel. And of course, all the great performers will come here. For example, Isadora Duncan. The great dancer. Of course, how she dies. She's one of these people who's always swirling things around her, and she has a great long scarf, and she's out with one of her toy boys in a Bugatti about to sort of, he puts on his foot on the brake, goes off, and the scarf gets caught around the back wheel and presumably breaks her neck, or would it choke her? I need an expert medical opinion. I imagine it'd she'd strangle, not very nice. Anyway, but you die the way you live. By now, we also have Nice being, as I said, shown as glamorous, as sort of literally the jet set of the time, or the gliding set, shall we say, of the time, flying over, but throwing up flowers. Do you notice that? You've still got this idea of sensuality. And by now you've got Nice as being the new age, right? This is by the 1920s, and you have a whole new idea of the body, right? The body is something which is now cultivated for itself, no longer as just the vehicle of the mind or the soul, etc. You now get, this is when Coco Chanel, of course, steps off her boat at the Cap d'Antibes with a suntan. This is revolutionary. No one had ever wanted to have their skin coloured because it was only the serfs and the peasants who had brown skin. Now, if you had brown skin, it meant you had the money to spend your time in one of these extraordinary hotels on the Côte d'Azur doing nothing. So that's why the suntan, of course, becomes important. And you get the development of sea bathing and all of that. So here you have people now showing off their skin rather than sort of hiding it as you had before with the crinolines. And of course the Promenade des Anglais, I don't know what's the matter with this, and the car whizzing along. Now, it wasn't just the jet set that now had come down to Nice and to the south of France. Now, I wanted you to come, this is Nice here. You can see how close Cannes-sur-Mer is. And we're looking at St. Paul and Vence, which will figure quite importantly in the art of both these two artists that I'm going to talk about. Now, Renoir had gone his own way from the Impressionists after exhibiting for about the third time. And he, at one stage, had felt, in fact, had said, look, Impressionism has gone as far as it can. I need to go in a new direction. And he takes himself off to Italy and studies the great Renaissance painters of the time, particularly Titian, and also looks very much at Rubens. And decides that he is going to do something different, and is lured down to the south of France. He's already gone down to the south on a kind of a visit with Monet. But as he gets older, he develops a kind of rheumatoid arthritis, and he's told by his doctors that the heat will do him good. So in the age, I think he's probably in his late 60s, when he comes down to Cagnes-sur-Mer and establishes himself in this wonderful little area. That is the painting that he actually, there should be Les Colettes, that he does of his farmhouse, and it's still exactly the same way today. So here you have this sort of luxurious sort of it's not a lot of flowers, but the old olive trees, which are very important for him, as I'll talk about in a moment. And he has wonderful views of the sea. Now, this is our boy at the age of 7. I think he dies when he's, what, 78, is it? 78, and you can see he's a very old 78. By the time he was at this age, he couldn't hold a brush. It had to be strapped onto his hand, and he's sitting in a wheelchair, and he could just continue to sort of paint. But the joy that he gets from painting still comes through very much. Now, as we know, Renoir is sort of the great decorative artist of the Impressionists. You know, he loves sort of the flesh tones and the colours, and in fact, one of the main motives of his art is, of course, the female nude. Well, when he couldn't actually do these sort of paintings, he did smaller formats where he get this sort of the same caressing that he have of female flesh that you get with his brushstrokes. You get here sort of a caressing of the petals of the flowers. So these are very much red tones. And the last of his works that he actually does in 1919 are the great bathers. And this is reference very much to what I was saying about the south of France being a kind of Mediterranean paradise, which refers back to Greece and Rome and the sort of the Arcadia, the time of a kind of timeless paradise. Now, Renoir, of course, was someone who didn't like progress. He didn't like the new society of the Industrial Revolution. He didn't like the new role that women were taking on, you know, that women that were cavorting on those posters that we saw. You know, women were supposed to be totally dominated by their biology, you know, simply sort of sensual objects, and you can see this here, sort of all backsides and bosoms and no head. So this, so therefore, well, they've got a small head, but absolutely blank expression. So this idea then of the timeless Arcadian landscape, this eternal nature of the female nude, which he has pursued throughout his life, and this sort of homage to Rubens and to Titian, so connecting himself with the great painters of the Renaissance, but still using a kind of Impressionist technique, but which now likens him very much to the sculptor Mayol. Do you know his great sort of large figures? And he also sculpted at this time. Now, this, you'll see in the background this little group over here. Well, this is a group that he had painted in 1887 with his wife and his model, Aline. That's Aline, and this is Suzanne Valadon, who's a painter in her own right. So they're back there in the background. Now, he felt that this was his masterpiece. He said that I'm finally beginning to get it, he sort of said, basically just before he died. He saw this as the culmination of all his work, and so this was donated to the French state by his 3 sons in 1923. Now, someone else who, of course, comes to the south, I'd have to move quickly through, is Chagall, who his work is absolutely dominated by the flattened canvases that we were talking about at the beginning of this lecture, where it is the light and the colour which dominates. And he is persuaded to set up this cycle of paintings which refer to the Bible, in a museum outside Nice. I really haven't time to talk about him very much because I want to actually talk about Matisse. Now, if one sort of painter really sort of symbolises Nice and symbolises what landscape can do for your painting style, it has to be this symbiosis between Nice, light, colour, and Matisse. Matisse, perhaps with Picasso and Duchamp as sort of the great painters, and with Cézanne as well, that bridge from the 19th to the 20th century and lead into abstractionism. Now, he started out as living in the north of France, in a very dark, dank area around Saint-Quentin, in a family and with relatives who deal in weaving, not in tapestries, but in materials and in working with dyes, which means that he is sort of brought up with this this very much in an atmosphere of decorativeness, which I think is really quite important when you look at the last development of his art. He, of course, didn't want to be, his family wanted to be a lawyer. I mean, this goes through every painter of the time. Finally persuades them and goes down and studies at the Atelier Julien, and finally succeeds enough to go into the Beaux-Arts, where he has as his teacher and mentor no one else but Gustave Moreau. Now, I hope some of you have been to the exhibition. And I'll have to give a plug here that I'm giving a floor talk on Sunday if anyone wants to come along. As yet, totally unwritten, but that's... anyhow, the thing that's important about Moreau is this... he's a great sort of academic painter. He believed in the tenets of the salon, the importance of narrative painting, but he's a revolutionary in the sense that he takes it in another direction. So he's not at all interested in progress, he's not at all interested in all this business of materialism and seizing the moment and light and everything. He's interested in dream atmospheres, telling the same stories maybe as academic art, but in a different way with a different technique. And he teaches Rouault and Matisse to follow their own bent and gives them this intense interest in colour. So the first works of Matisse, you will see this progression from these very dark palettes. Now, already you have the subject matter which will continue in his art right through. You get the still life in interiors and a single, look, I'm going to give up using this, a single female figure with, again, an anonymous figure to some degree. All of Matisse's figures are completely absorbed and away from us, all right? They're not interacting with other people or with us. And this is one of the interesting things with having this woman seen from behind. Now, as again, we've already looked at this, he paints, actually goes along to see John Peter Russell at Belle, is introduced to the Impressionist palette there, and then becomes influenced by Signac. And experiments with divisionist painting for some time, then moves on to and abandons that simply because he feels firstly it's too time consuming, and it doesn't actually, he feels, give this sense of luminosity and decorativeness that he actually is searching for. So he then goes to Collioure. Now Collioure, he marries a woman who comes from Toulouse, and this is why he's actually drawn down further and further down the south of France. Collioure is a little fishing village just across the border from Spain. And here he begins one of these series of paintings which are so emblematic of Matisse, where you get the collapsing of the interior and the exterior. So here you have the windows open out onto another world, but it's beginning to be extremely flattened, all right? You still have those two leading, those volets, the things on the window are sort of taking you in towards the boats, but in actual fact the picture plane has been flattened. There's movement in it. You can still see the use of divisionism is still actually there a bit, the way in which he has actually emphasized the brush strokes. So we're no longer, you see, as with the Impressionists, capturing just a moment. The color and the experience, the viewer's experience of the colour and the moment is what is important. Now, while he's there, Derain also paints with him, and this, of course, what they paint at Collioure will be the basis of their exhibition at the Salon d'Automne in 1905, which will be the Fauvist exhibition. Now, Derain here is used, colour for the Fauves was this idea of using it to express reactions or feelings, all right? So, but the colours often no longer correspond to reality, but here in Derain's they do. You still have the blue, which represents the sea, the green of the shadows, and the bright iridescent colours of the land, and the colours of the houses. Now, Derain actually is interesting in the sense that he goes in the other direction after having painted these absolutely sun-drenched landscapes, the bleaching and the brightness and the flattening nature of this bright light. He then actually goes back to Paris and starts painting in a much more subdued, subtle way. He's often not spoken about very much in many ways, because the French for a long time considered him a collaborator, and sort of his art was taken out of the mainstream because of that. He collaborated with the Germans. Now, Matisse in 1905 then exhibits with Marquet, Rouault, both of whom had been with him as students at Moreau's studio, and Dufy as well, and Derain, and exhibits a portrait of his wife, which in many ways is mocked very much the way the Impressionist exhibitions were. First exhibition, for example, I think you had the Déjeuner sur l'Herbe, was mocked at the same time, and the Impressionists were given the name Impressionist by a journalist. So you get the name Fauve being given to these people who exhibited it. There were these bright, outlandish, sort of coloured paintings, and in the centre you had a statue which looked like a Donatello, and so the journalist said, "Oh goodness, Donatello amongst the wild beasts," and so Fauve in French being wild beasts, they were called the Fauve movement. Now, they didn't have very much in common except this particular palette, and sort of very quickly moved there in their own separate directions. There's another painting that he did at the time of his wife with a green stripe down his face. So colour no longer represents reality, right? We've actually moved completely away from that. What we started with the Impressionists with art actually being paint on a canvas, but it still does represent something that you are supposed to have seen. Now the colour no longer represents reality at all. The colour in itself is what is important. It's your experience of this image which is foregrounded. He was derided by the public. However, someone very important noticed this and bought it. This was Gertrude Stein, who was the great collector of the time, and who will build up a great collection of Matisse, will introduce him to her brother, and in fact her two brothers who are collectors, and her sister-in-law, who will promote his work, and he will become known in America through this. Now, at this time, he's a strange man, Matisse. He was known as the Professor, really. He's always little glasses, and he was sort of, in many ways, was being taken over by this avant-garde scene, but he didn't fit in at all with the kind of Montmartre, wildness and absinthe and everything. He was a very serious man who was pursuing his art as a kind of undying passion. I'll be about 5 minutes over. Is that okay? Right. He then moves down to the south and takes up digs in one of the hotels, which is on the Promenade des Anglais. So, and paints from his window, is absolutely blown away by the atmosphere of Nice, and decides to settle there in 1917. And where I showed you the penitent chapels before? Well, at the end of that, there's this wonderful flower market, and then the other side of this building here, you actually have the sea. So when he actually managed to get this upstairs studio, he had a view out across the Mediterranean, the Bay of Angels. He has a view up to the beautiful parts of Chimieres with its wonderful sort of vegetation and ruins, and down here across the old city with its, winding streets and markets and flower markets and bustling religious processions and so on. So it was an ideal vantage point. Now, it's here that he the progression with his art is gradual flattening out of the picture plane and the sense of the work being given purely by the vibrancy of the colour. And here we have the dance. Now this has actually evidently been inspired by Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. By now he actually has powerful patrons who are commissioning him. There was a man who's a Russian named Shulukov, I can't pronounce, and Barnes, both of whom will commission the dance. They want it for their homes. And this then is the paring down there's no shadows, there's no, there's no conflicting. You've just got this brilliant essence of Mediterranean joyfulness. This that started out with the hedonism of tourism. Here you get returned to this sort of Arcadian basic sort of paradise of joy. And here the dance, you're not distracted by looking at these as though they're figures. Oh, there's Auntie Jo or something like that. They're abstract forms that have the essence of movement and joyousness in them. So these were given to a private collection. He then, by now, moves on, and you can see he does a whole series of works which relate to this odalisque, this idea of this harem woman, and he paints it because it relates to Morocco, to the south, the idea of this exotic culture of colour. And when he went to Morocco, he brought back with him carpets and objects. He's very much influenced also by Delacroix, by the way, who did the same thing. And in a corner of his studio, he has all of this sort of almost this eastern section set up with all these objects and poses his nudes there. So this return to the nude, very much like Renoir, as sort of being the basic element of Western art, right? But in a kind of decorative setting. So here, if you actually look at that very carefully, it looks as though the picture plane has been completely flattened, and it is just sheer decoration. In actual fact, you can pick out there's a mirror, an elaborate mirror behind the woman's head. This is a carpet that you'll see in many of his paintings. She's on another carpet, but he's actually picked her out so that this is coming towards us, looks bigger. So you actually do get the nude, even though it's the triangular form with a pure oval face. You get the draping here, which also comes out towards us, so you don't get the nude completely subsumed into the decorative background. Now, Matisse by now was very ill. He'd been advanced, and he'd employed a secretary who, as secretaries often do, had managed to worm her way into this happens with Picasso, it happens with every single one of these painters that end up, I won't go into it, it's a whole sociological thing. Anyway, his wife, who has stood by him through thick and through thin and been his wife of 41 years, leaves him, and his children also will not speak to him. Even when he's dying, you'll have her on one side and the daughter on the other, who will sit by his bedside for something like 3 weeks without addressing a word to each other. Anyhow, this woman becomes his muse and also inherits an awful lot of works of art on the way. But he paints her many, many times, and she now is subsumed very much into this. The whole picture plane has become one of flattened decoration. Now, I just want to look, by now we're getting towards the very end of his life, and things have become extremely flattened. Now, the picture plane has become just basically one dazzling colour of red, and the elements in it seem to float. So you no longer have anything really located in time or space. All right, so in other words, you've moved completely away. You see, the Impressionists moved out of the narrative element and the element of the ideals of art and didactic means and everything. This new sort of art does away with even our ideas of where you are in time and space. But you do have things actually very deliberately placed. If you look at this, you've got this vase in the middle, almost like an altarpiece with like the Virgin Mary with 4 saints around it. And this, it's very cleverly done. You see, you've got this shape over here, which is reiterated here and reiterated here. It's the whole picture plane is very, very contrived, whereas it looks like a random placing of these objects, but they all evoke the joyousness of this south of, you know, of the Mediterranean climate. You know, the leaves and the flowers and the seashells and more flowers and sort of bright ceramics, you know. There's a kind of joyousness that is exuded from this art. At the end of his life, he manages to get an apartment in the Regina Hotel, which has now been sold off as apartments, and he actually buys 2 of them and turns them into 1. By now, he's a very ill old man. He's very much like Renoir. In fact, he admired Renoir. He visited Renoir when he was crippled and said, "I hope I have the same courage when I'm like that," and indeed, Matisse does. And right at the end of his life, he, first of all, he's now living with this secretary come muse come all the rest, and she no longer, of course, wants to be his nurse, and so he puts an advertisement in the paper for a young and pretty nurse. He's about 75 at this time, and who should turn up but Monique Bourgeois, who works for him for 2 years and then takes the veil as a Dominican nun. And by sheer chance, her order ends up, she's sent to Vence, where Matisse has been weathering out the war. And he meets her there, and she sort of explains that the order want to build a chapel. They've only got an old garage. You know, can he suggest anything? And he decides that this is going to be his final masterpiece, and he takes on the entire building of the Chapel of the Rosary, dedicated to the Rosary. St. Dominic was the one who, Kathleen, am I right, who introduces the Rosary? Yes? Yes, right, well. So that's why you get the connection between the Dominicans and the Rosary. And he takes over the architecture. He will do the stained glass. He does all the implements which are on the altar. He does all the walls, the ceramics. He even does the vestments for the priest. And it takes him about 3 years. We'll see when we go to the Matisse Museum all the little models that he did for this. The Dominicans are a bit worried about it, but when they finally see it unveiled, they think it is amazing. Now, what is of interest for me in this lecture is that he works intimately with the nature of the place. All right, it is now this building will be on the hill of Vence, not Saint Paul, but at Vence, looking out over the sea. And he will spend a long time, months, cataloguing the quality and the intensity of the light. And finally, the stained glass windows that he will produce have 3 colours in them. They have the deep blue of the sea, and the green of the vegetation on the Côte d'Azur, and these yellow leaves, which are a kind of cactus flower which blooms on it was the main vegetation. And there is no other colour in this chapel. It's completely white. You've got dead white ceramic walls. You've got the sandstone altar, but the floors are white. And the only colour is brought in from the light falling through these windows, which represent the glory of primitive nature. And so as the seasons change, as the time of day changes, so the patterns that are spread across the walls change. So it's very much like the cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals, where you had this idea of the presence of God as light, you know, with Saint Denis' concept of God as light. This is in many ways the same sort of thing. It's really interesting. He was Picasso approached him when he was actually working on this and had said, "For heaven's sake, you're an atheist. Why are you doing this? How can you actually produce something as intense as this when you don't believe in it?" And he said, "Well, I might not be a Christian, but I sort of do believe in this sort of spirituality, and I want this to be my last sort of complete work." So he has by now pared down his art, and mainly also out of necessity, because he, like Renoir, can't really paint. He's got, he can hardly, his fingers don't work. He also has to, paint on a stick. He's in a wheelchair. And so this is why you also get this extraordinarily simplified vision of St. Dominic. But it's not just for that. It's this paring and paring away right down to the absolute essentials, which is line and the basic colours now, which are black and white for St. Dominic. Now, this is the way in which what it looks like from the outside. So you really, in many ways, can't get a better example, I think, of place and geography influencing an artist's creation than at the chapel at Vence, where it's the spirit of the place, the light and the colours of the Mediterranean which inspire the spirituality of the area. And the last image that I like to have is something which has entered into our sort of Western subconscious of art, is of course this blue nude, which this sort of meditation on sort of the basic sort of forms of Western art, pared down and pared and pared and pared down into these sinuous lines, but this intense blue, which I see as being this intense blue of the Mediterranean landscape. Thank you. Thanks.